Hey folks, welcome to Role of Law. So let's talk about the ORC license and why I think it's a bad thing for gaming generally. If you don't know much about the ORC, we're going to start with an ORC crash course. The ORC is an aggressively viral copyleft license where the designers, which is primarily Paizo and Azora Law, hope it'll actively take over and basically infect the entirety of the gaming community, that this license will spread through everything and become universal. It is intentionally designed to not be able to be ever modified. So if there's something wrong with it now, that'll be the case for it forever. And the reason why it's designed to not be modified is that for it to be modified requires some kind of central authority, and they want to eliminate that. That's in part because of the OGL 1.1 debacle. Now, the critical clause in the ORC that we're going to be talking about and is of concern is this one. Grant of adapted ORC content by you. You hereby receive an offer from the licensor to exercise the licensed rights on the express condition that you do, and hereby grant to every recipient of the adapted ORC content an offer to exercise the licensed rights in the adapted ORC content under the terms and conditions hereof, pursuant to which such adapted ORC content shall be licensed as ORC content to such recipient. You may not offer or impose any additional or different terms or conditions on, or apply any effective technological measures to the ORC content if doing so restricts exercise of the licensed rights by any recipient of the ORC content. So basically, if you use any ORC content in your work under license, you then have to license out all of your work that is potentially covered by ORC out to the rest of the world. And that means all of the mechanical content as well as content that is near the mechanics. They can then resell that content if they want, reuse it, or just straight up copy it wholesale and give it away for free. Whatever they want to do, the ORC allows them to do it, so long as they offer it under the same terms. Stuff that would be included as things you have to give away like this would include the entirety of any classes, traps, magic items, monsters, spells, and so forth, minus any specific proper nouns that distinguish it as product identity to your setting, like Mordenkainen or whatever, might be appropriate to your setting or whatever. So if you don't have any of those things in your content, then you'd be giving away the entirety of all of those things. Now, the precise borders on these things may be a little fuzzy, but it's clear from conversations with the folks behind this on their Discord that the intention is for this to apply very broadly. If you write a very complex trap with detailed descriptions of how it works and how to describe it in play, the entire thing would be released to the public for free. That's way more than the pure mechanics, which arguably aren't protectable anyway, and on to creative descriptions and text, which otherwise would be. Those would otherwise be yours to protect against the entire world, but you have to give them up. So let's talk about some of the problems. And the first problem is just in terms of the philosophy, which is that this is about control. This whole thing is about enforcing control on the downstream community. Those are the people who are sort of receiving things from, sort of upstream, and the farthest upstream is whoever designed the game, by a clause that requires people downstream to give things up. Now, you might think that this is laudable control for good purposes, that it intends to get more content shared. However, that doesn't mean it isn't control. Well-intentioned efforts at control often go awry. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this license is also not written as one with any central authority, meaning that this control is just generally put into the hands of whoever is upstream on these licensing arrangements, which means that some of this control will ultimately be wielded by people you trust, and some of it will be wielded by people you don't trust. And ultimately, the people that you trust will probably do right by you either way. But for the people inclined to behave badly, the ORC can be used as a sword against you, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This control is designed to expand, because they'll say using any ORC content requires that ORC license, and to be permanent. It's intended to push a very copyleft view and set of practices onto the community and enshrine it there permanently, regardless of the cost this has to the community. There's basically a vision of sort of a utopian setup here, and it's intending to set that in place in the community at large. That's potentially dangerous. The next problem is that it's very unequal in its redistribution. The ORC is designed to require that certain kinds of content be given away to the world at large, so long as they also agree to the ORC license. However, this is very uneven between different sorts of third-party content. Someone who writes content that's primarily narrative, such as a dungeon that uses no new mechanics, or a campaign setting, or any of these kinds of things, those people are likely to only receive benefits from the ORC without having to give much away. They may not, in fact, have to give anything away, not even a single word of new content, to anyone downstream. Meanwhile, people whose work is primarily homebrew sort of crunch mechanics, crunchy different things, such as writing new traps, spells, magic items, and so forth, may receive very little from the ORC license, but may have to give away nearly their entire work. And I'll just notice that these are quite popular things when you look at, the marketplaces, what people are selling online. A lot of this stuff is very popular. People pay money for this stuff. And this may threaten that. This may in turn result in less content of one type and more content of the other, simply because the narrative creators are allowed to protect all or almost all of their work, but the other creators are allowed to protect virtually nothing. And so you can get a situation where one creator is allowed to take everything from the other, and the other gets nothing back in return. And that seems to me to be a little unfair. This also tends to benefit upstream creators more than downstream creators. The enforcement powers flow one way. The upstream can enforce license terms against the downstream, but not the other way around. If you're the owner of the base game system, this also lets you pick out the best content of the entire third-party creator pool for your games and use it in your official books, which by nature of being official and not third-party content, will naturally have a tremendous market advantage. You just can't compete with, hey, my book is official, versus this book is homebrew. There's no way for a third-party creator to compete with that in any realistic universe. And they won't have to pay those people a single dime. This is going to be permitted absolutely. This means that the entire third-party creator market for a particular game becomes a buffet table at which the upstream developer can eat for free and where the downstream has basically no recourse. If someone takes the entirety of your adapted ORC content and reprints it in their own work, whether for money or for free, you won't even be able to issue a takedown notice. You'll have no ability to stop this whatsoever. Now, this also adopts a maximalist view of copyright. This is our next problem. A ton of stuff in tabletop role-playing is simply not protectable. Pure mechanical content is not protectable because you simply can't own math through copyright. The concept of rolling a 20-sided die is not protectable. The concept of having a 30% chance or a chance derived from other statistics to avoid taking a particular sort of randomized amount of damage is not protectable. But other stuff falls into a gray area of probably not protectable on to maybe possibly not protectable, like stat blocks or various representations of a character's abilities. However, the probably is what gets people here. That uncertainty makes people nervous because if you're looking to make third-party content for a game for basically beer money, you may not want to run that risk. And that uncertainty is also what is being leveraged to push the ORC as widely as possible. Sign up to this license and we won't sue you over that probably stuff. Statements from the drafters so far is that they expect that in order to use those areas of uncertainty, they want you to sign on to the ORC. And this is a bad thing because it's further pushing the view and attaching financial incentive to the view that a lot more content is protected than likely is by law. And that's concerning, right? Because it leads to our next point. Enforcement of the ORC is via lawsuit. So the way this whole copyleft vision gets pushed onto the community is by the threat of lawsuit. You don't play ball, you get sued. That's the inherent issue with any license that involves control over the people downstream, is that the only way to enforce this is suing people. If you say you want to control what other people do, that means that you're inherently adopting a posture of being willing to sue over this because you're asking for that control. We can compare this with the position of Scene Nominee Publishing, who actually don't operate with any license at all, because they've said their position is that the basic stat blocks and way to play the game, the essential API of the game, is not content that they consider protectable at all. That's the minimalist position here. They've also indicated that they have no desire to control or sue anyone down the line. Unless you start ripping off their setting wholesale, they just have no desire to enforce this. By contrast, the ORC license is one that does indicate a desire to enforce and claims a very broad swath of content as things that they have a right to enforce. This also creates the very real possibility that in enforcing the ORC license, they push for precedent that effectively locks down a lot more content than would otherwise have been locked down. That, I think, is going to be very bad for the community if that comes to pass. The simple existence of this license and the demands for concessions in order to use content in this gray area suggests a willingness to sue over it and a belief in a right to receive a benefit for the use of that content. Basically, we think this is ours, and in order for you to use it, you need to give up all of that, you need to give up that control that we want. The next problem is it doesn't fulfill its promises. So a number of people on the Discord have talked about an advantage of the ORC being that you can use that license and you know you won't get sued. Problem is, it doesn't promise that, and it can't promise that. There is no way to get there. A work that you use could purport to contain nothing but content that is freely available via the ORC. Everything in it, it says, is open to you to use under the ORC license. But if the author of that work is using content that they don't have the right to sublicense, they can't give you the power to use it because they don't have that ability. So you'd be infringing whoever actually owned that work. You can argue innocent infringement, which is a legal concept and is complicated, and I'm not really going to be able to get into in full detail here. But innocent infringement just reduces your liability rather than eliminating it. And innocent infringement can be really, really hard to establish. There's a lot of criteria for it, and a lot of it is very, very hard to actually establish in a courtroom. If you violate the terms of the ORC, you can be sued. If you use content that wasn't properly licensed, you can be sued. There is no magic bullet here. Just because you're using content from a work that is ORC licensed does not free you from the requirement to make sure that you're not violating copyright in some fashion, and you still might end up getting sued. And the next thing is it can be manipulated. And without getting too far into the weeds about things like corporate structures and sub-companies and so forth, there's various ways that someone could try to shield content from the ORC. So saying, listen, I'm going to use some ORC content, but I want to make sure that this new trap or this new spell isn't in turn licensed under ORC. So there's various ways that can be done. That's sort of a topic for another video. But in many cases, the only way to stop that would be for Paizo or someone else to sue based on a very aggressive copyright maximalist interpretation of what is and is not protected, which would potentially be very bad for the community as a whole, as I mentioned. This also means that there's no real guarantee that you gain access to any particular content from someone who's relying on ORC work, unless you're willing to sue them. The next aspect is that it doesn't play well with other licenses. Because the ORC license seeks to impose control, it doesn't play well with other licenses with different terms. In fact, it may be against the terms of the ORC license to apply it to works used under another license, which means that it may end up locking out content simply because of the two licenses being contradictory. The most likely scenario for this is you want to take content from one game and adapt it to another game. Both games may have licenses that say, we've got no problem with doing it, but because the licenses don't play well together, you may end up having a product that simply can't be co-licensed and therefore can't be made. So this is an inherent feature of the attempt to control the downstream. Now, I know that a common answer to this is just work out a better agreement with the people upstream. But if the stuff you want to use has 10 names on the attribution, you're talking about one of the labors of Hercules to get them all in line to make whatever you want to do possible. And there's simply no guarantee that the people upstream are going to play ball in any way. There's no guarantee that that'll be available at all. The next problem is that this will result in people being surprised and in arguments over boundaries. A lot of people who make content won't carefully read over and understand the ORC license before they invoke it, and may well give away way more than they plan to, entirely by accident. This is a recipe for hurt feelings, anger within the community, and potentially litigation. Because this is a mandatory sublicensing rather than a voluntary one, you may well get fights and arguments when someone downstream wants to reuse content that the person upstream didn't realize they were giving away and didn't want to give away, and in fact still doesn't want to give away. That person may be someone they'd never do business with normally, or someone who's just taking content to sell for their own profit as a free rider. That's something that's going to get a lot of people's dander up. Voluntary licenses where people choose how much to give away avoid this problem because people are setting their own limits. If I say, hey, I'm giving away this particular spell, then I'm probably not going to be upset if somebody downstream is using it. But if I didn't mean to give that away and somebody downstream is using it, now I'm mad. And in short, I think this is a bad idea and bad for the community, although made with good intentions. The problem is that because it's a viral license, once it gets out there and it gets any real adoption, it can be very difficult to back away from it if the community later decides that this has been a bad idea. So, this one is also a bit of a problem here because you've got a lot of people who make this third-party content because they love the game, they want to share things back, and if they find that they get burned, that they have a bad experience doing it, they may just stop, they may give up and go away. And that's a problem. If we lose some of these people who do this really great work out there, then the community is harmed by this. This is an actual negative thing. So what's the answer to all of this? Well, right now, Paizo is taking community feedback on this one. I will link to the page where they're announcing this. They've got their Discord where you can log in and give your thoughts. Now, if you want to make your voice heard, now is the time, but do so respectfully, please. Don't go in and throw crap, just raise issues. If you've got concerns, let them know that you've got concerns, but this isn't the time to insult anybody. As I've said, I think everybody involved in this is acting with good intentions. Nobody here is, wearing the devil horns or otherwise, nobody's sort of doing mustache cackling, evil here. This is just different views on what is best. So please be respectful. Personally, I am going to operate in what I consider to be the safer areas of the gray zone and hope that the negative press from trying to sue me to enforce those maximalist views of copyright would be unpalatable to the industry players trying to push their vision onto the community. I'm hoping that if they decide, hey, listen, we're going to sue you over using, strength saving throw, that would be too much negative press to make it worth it. But that involves risk, and I can't recommend it to anyone who isn't obstinate as hell, because fundamentally, if you get this wrong, and I think I'm right, but think is a key word there. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting. There's a lot of risk at hand. So if that's an angle you're considering, you should talk to a lawyer, because a YouTube video is not legal advice. It's just a lawyer talking to the world, but you need to get some assessment as to your specific circumstances. So I'm not your lawyer. I'm just a lawyer. Anyway, I guess I'm also going to work up a variation on the ORC license that I'm calling the ELF license. ELF doesn't stand for anything. It's just based on fantasy animosity between orcs and elves, and the fact that people say I look like an elf. So hence the ELF license. Now, the ELF license is designed to build on some of the good ideas of the ORC, and I think there's some really good ideas in the ORC, but without the attempts to control the downstream community. I call it sort of a shackle-free license. In fact, I thought about including provisions to say, if you use the ELF license, then you can't use the ORC license. And then I thought, no, I don't want to do that. That's even a form of control that I think is inappropriate. So I'm not even going to include that. Basically, it'll be a mechanism for sharing content you want to share, as well as a mechanism for how attribution should work, because attribution is reasonable and in a lot of areas required by copyright rules anyway. So I'm not going to pretend that this will gain any traction, in part because people always tend to want to tell others what to do and not to let them decide for themselves, and in part because I've got 7,500 subscribers. I'm not exactly a major industry player here. But this would be a license for publishers who want to assure their communities that they don't plan on suing them and that they can decide for themselves what to give away and what not to. The ELF license will be a license that trusts the community to behave well and to pass things along without dictating, without demanding. And I think that communities can work this out for themselves. If they think that somebody is being stingy and not giving anything back to the community, I think that can be settled with reputation and so forth, rather than needing litigation. The ELF license is going to be one that is really designed to protect you from being sued. That's really what it's about. It's about a good and efficient way to give content away without making any demands on people. So, like I said, I know I'm tilting at windmills here, but I think there's a better way to go than where things seem to be headed. So I want to do what I can to try to sort of create a better way. And I think this is important. But I'm going to be honest here. This is a fight I expect to lose. I expect that we're going to see this, and I expect that we are going to see some of these problems that I'm mentioning come to a head. So anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. I mean, let me know if you think I'm out to lunch. That is a perfectly fair, thing to say. I want to know what people are feeling, but yeah, as I said, I'm going to link to the Paizo announcement of the ORC license, which also in turn links to their Discord. If you want to give comments, I think there's other ways of giving feedback as well. They might have email or something like that. Again, be respectful. I'll also throw a link to my Discord in the description below as well, so that if you want to come talk about things like the ELF license or just gaming in general or silliness in general, you can do that. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts, and see you next time.